Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm Diane Deziel and today I'm doing the assembling of a bustier with the cup. Now the first thing is of course to cut all your piece. My cup bustier has 5 main pattern pieces for the bottom part and 2 additional pieces for the cup. So altogether you have 7 pieces to cut. Center front is on fold. Then in case you want to add additional padding to your cup, the first thing you must do is put them one over the other and do a stay stitch all around so you could consider them as one piece. That's what I did here on one of my pieces, but you do that on all your pieces. Just back to back and stitch all around. For this one, I decided to do it only on one side so I could show you the difference. The next thing is going to be to align all your pieces to make sure there's no confusion and put at least one pin to hold them together before you go do your normal seam allowance. Here I'm going to insist to be very accurate when you go make your seam, because even 1 millimeter bigger seam allowance could make your bustier a size smaller because there's so many seams. Same thing with the opposite. If you take your seam allowance a little too small, you're going to make your bustier one size bigger. So be precise. And when you complete the straight assembling for all your bustier piece, even with the cup, the 2 pieces together, you do exactly the same thing with the lining. Now when all your pieces are assembled, it's time to do a nice pressing, all the seam open, and you're going to do open seam even on the cup piece. If you do have problem to iron your cup piece, the seam here, you must use your hand to press it. And if you do have problem to iron and to keep it open, what I suggest is that you do a little top stitch on both sides of the seam to keep the seam allowance in the right position. Usually the bottom part, the seam are pretty straight, so it's okay. They do stay, but for the cup, very often it's hard to have it flat. So you do your little top stitch. I know top stitch make it look a bit more sporty, but if you do very tiny or narrow top stitch, one on each side, and you use tiny stitch with the same color thread, already doesn't look so sporty. This is something that I do very often when there is curve. Also, it might be much easier for you to keep the seam open, especially if you did use the foam like I did for that side. Now, when all your pieces are pressed and top stitch wherever you need top stitch, it's going to be time to assemble the cup with the round area of the bottom part. Now, as you could see, the piece that we have to sew together, they have opposite curve. You'll see that especially when you want to assemble them face to face, just like that. So for that seam, it's going to be again very important that you respect your seam allowance. If you're new to bustier, you might just trace here and there with a disappearing marker or a little pencil with a light color, just trace or mark your seam allowance. We have one seam that we want to match. So I suggest, to make your life easier, to start there. So you'll do your seam in 2 steps, one time on one side, one time on the other side. Start right there, align your seam with the seam on the bottom part, just like that, and you will sew, lifting the foot very often and moving the top part just like that all the way to the end. When you're done on one side, then you flip it and you do the other side. So this is already attached and you'll go just like that, little by little, moving the bottom part this time to match the top part until you reach the top. When you do that seam, remember that you have 3 references. You have 1 notch at the center front, Over here, you have the princess line that should align also, and you must have a double notch on the back side or towards the side seam. So at this step, you're going to sew 1, 2, and 3, 4 cup into your bustier. Now that we sewed the 4 cups, so 2 on the self and 2 on the lining, it's time to talk about the tape or the special ribbon to insert the wire, the under wire. There is 2 main different tape, one that looks curly like this one and another one that is straight, but they are specially made to insert the wire. Why specially made? Because they're double. And if you push a little bit at the end like that, you could see that the wire goes in perfectly. Same thing for the straight one. Now, out of these 2, the one that is curly is much easier to use, and it does a better result at the end also. Because look at the straight one, what you get, a lot of ease here, and it's stiff. So with the straight one, it's a little hard to follow a curved shape. While with the curly one, you could see that it's perfectly flat, very easy to follow the shape of the wire. So now when you're ready to sew your tape, you're going to take your bustier and hold it just the 2 layer or the 3 layer that we just sew. On the cup side, you're going to place your tape. You could start at about 1 centimeter from the edge or the seam allowance value. Just like that, you're going to place it right next to your seam. And you're going to stitch the tape only on one side, just the side. You see the little line here, you're going to stitch right on just that side of the tape. When you get to the other side, you could do the same thing, just cut your tape or ribbon about 1 centimeter before the end of the fabric. Now when your tape is sewn, you're already going to decide which side you're going to insert, usually the underarm. So at the center front side, you could already do a tack, 2 little seam tack well. It's only the seam allowance, so it's not going to show on the right side of the fabric. Then you're going to really pull to make sure there's no pleat, and you're going to stitch the other side of your tape. You have to sew in that little edge. It's like a line you could see, and that's where you have to stitch, just like we did on the other side. But this time it's going to be an apparent top stitch because you're going to do it through all the layers. So little stitch right there. Make sure you don't create pleat under, pulling on both sides, and you top stitch all around. Now we could insert the wire, the under wire. Then you have to tack the other side to make sure that your wire is not going to come out. Then you'll be ready to assemble your lining with the bustier, with the self part. Now at this point, it's time to do your zipper opening. But here, like you could see, I don't have the full bustier. I just did the top and the side panel. I don't have the back. So I'm not going to do the zipper. But the sewing step would be the same as I did in my normal or regular bustier. You could see my video on the assembling. And I would follow pretty much the same steps. So I would sew my lining on top at the bottom, close one side, and the last side I usually open the lining and go close the last opening. But for that you must see my other video where I do the assembling of the plain bustier. For today I just want to talk about the little difference or the little thing that I do extra for that cup bustier. So for now I'm going to just sew the top part, the lining and the self, and I'm going to do an understitch on the lining. Now, when you finish assembling the lining with the self, before doing the understitch, I suggest that you slash or you do notches on the curved part of the cup. You remove little triangle, both sides. And also, before doing your understitch, just make one notch on each side here at the center front area. Then you could do your understitch on the lining and turn it inside out. The little extra step that I suggest you do for that kind of bustier is attack from the inside to make sure that the lining is not coming out, especially if you did the cup with the foam. So now I'm going to show you from the inside what I want you to do. You go between the two layers and you're going to grab one seam allowance of the self with one seam allowance of the lining. Just look at it from the top. Make sure that the lining stay inside from the outside like that. And you grab your seam. You could also verify if you're at the right level because you do have notches. If you rather do it at the notch area, that's very secure. So you take notch and notch just like that, and you're going to stitch them together. It's only one layer of the seam allowance, and you're going to tack them together for about 1 centimeter. For now, just to show you, I'm going to put a pin exactly where I would stitch them together. Now if we look from the outside, so the work is done. You do that, of course, for both sides, and I suggest you also do it one time under the cup, so to that seam, for exactly the same reason. So you go between the layer, and these seams, they have notch also, so you could use the notch that you see. The first one that we see, place the notch together and just tack for about 1 centimeter. I'll do it again over here with the pin, but you do it with the machine, of course. And this is also going to help, you see, the lining stays inside. Finally, the last detail I want you to look at is how it falls with the foam inside. It makes a very big difference. I think it looks much better. Of course, I do prefer with the tiny little foam. Even if it's a tiny one, it does make a big difference. That's it for today. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I see you next time.